Chosen one, welcome, legends. You didn't come this far to blend in, and deep down, you know it. This isn't just another chapter in your life. This is the chapter. The one where everything they tried to bury you under becomes the very soil you rise from. The one where what they meant for harm turns into your greatest fuel. Let me tell you something they never wanted you to realize. You were never ordinary. You were never meant to fit in their small expectations. And that's exactly why they tried to shrink you, silence you, and sideline you. But what they didn't count on was your resilience. What they didn't see coming was you. Because here's the truth. You are not here by accident. You carry something rare. Something too big for their boxes, too loud for their whispers, too strong for their storms. You're not broken. You're being built. You're not rejected. You're being refined. Tonight, we celebrate that. Tonight, you remember who you are. This is not about proving them wrong. It's about proving yourself right. It's about standing in rooms they never thought you'd reach and realizing you don't even need their approval to own the space. So stand tall, straighten your crown, step into this moment like you already know the ending. Because you do. You don't just survive what they threw at you, you turn it into a stage. You don't just carry the fire, you are the fire. Let's go. Looking for purpose and peace? Hit subscribe and start the journey. They assumed distance would erase what was essential, yet all it did was ignite a quiet evolution. When exclusion came, dressed as finality, they believed it would drain the air from your lungs, flatten your momentum, and strip away any spark that remained. In their view, shutting you out was a blow you wouldn't recover from, but they never imagined it would become the very condition for your metamorphosis. What looked like abandonment on the surface was actually a hidden chamber where unseen forces were shaping you. While they crowded themselves in familiar patterns and shallow rituals, you were elsewhere, unwatched, sharpening, unfolding into something far beyond their reach. Their eyes never caught the work happening in the shadows, where clarity grew quiet but unshakable, where resolve calcified into something no storm could disturb. They believed silence meant surrender, yet it was merely the sound of construction. Stripped of hollow applause and counterfeit loyalty, you came into alignment with something more enduring. They expected to see you crawl back diminished, yet you emerged refined, carrying a presence so undeniable, it unsettled the ones who underestimated you. Their confusion now stems not just from your return, but from the grace and depth they failed to recognize, which now moves without needing their permission or presence. Step beyond the screen. Join and help light the way for others. Separation didn't dismantle you. It revealed that they had mistaken the direction of dependence all along. They thought you drew strength from them, convinced that your balance relied on their approval. What they couldn't see was how much they were borrowing from your steadiness, how much of their confidence leaned on the quiet weight you carried without asking for credit. Once you stepped away, the hollowness of their circle became apparent. The brightness faded, and the rhythm faltered. They imagined you were an accessory to their story, but you were, in fact, the axis that kept it spinning. The stillness you left behind echoed louder than all their words ever did. Their laughter no longer reached the same heights, and the harmony they thought was theirs alone dissolved into awkwardness without you holding it all together. You didn't collapse because you had never been standing on them to begin with. They were balanced precariously on what you offered, and without it, the structure bent under its own weight. The realization dawns slowly on them now that what they thought dispensable was irreplaceable. And while they scrambled to rebuild the atmosphere you carried so effortlessly, you've already risen elsewhere, lighter, clearer, and untouched by the chaos they've been left to untangle. They assumed cutting you off would expose your weakness, but all it did was release you from the burden of holding up those who never truly saw the magnitude of what you carried. If your heart overflows with divine love, now is the moment to let it shine. Click the super thank you button on YouTube and give $50 or more to help carry God's light to others. Your gift will bless not only your life, but countless others. You are part of His sacred plan. Your kindness may be the answer to someone's prayer. Share your blessings and honor His kingdom. May His grace guide you always. What was intended as rejection became an encounter with untapped strength. Departure wasn't accidental. It was wielded as a blade meant to cut through confidence, to leave scars deep enough to silence even the most certain voice. They vanished with precision, thinking absence would erode every sense of value left behind, leaving only doubt to fill the gaps. The quiet wasn't gentle. It was designed as a trap to make the walls of the mind close in. Yet even carefully plotted abandonment failed to achieve its aim. Where they expected collapse, there was instead an awakening. The stillness they engineered as punishment became a chamber where unseen resilience was uncovered, where the layers of borrowed identity peeled away to reveal something more authentic beneath. In the hush they imposed, clarity arrived in whispers too subtle for a crowded room to hear. No longer measuring worth by shadows that left, the realization came slowly that being alone wasn't a sentence, but a key. What they thought would confine instead became a vast expanse where forgotten parts of self rose and rearranged into something unfamiliar and unshakable. Their exit was supposed to define the story, but all it did was illuminate their own fragility, their own need to orchestrate control where none was truly theirs. Emerging from the quiet was not just survival, but transformation. Grace without apology, vision without noise. The version that stepped out of the silence bore no resemblance to the one they tried to diminish. No bitterness lingered, only freedom, quiet and complete. What they intended to weaken became the catalyst for a strength they can no longer bend, touch, or even approach. The quiet they thought would consume instead became the sanctuary where a whole new force was born. Their carefully constructed circles echoed the same tired thoughts back and forth, while beyond their reach, a different rhythm began to take shape. They mistook proximity for insight, convinced that amplifying each other's words created meaning. Their gatherings sounded full, but held no weight, just the familiar pattern of unexamined belief, bouncing around in endless repetition. Meanwhile, outside their noise, a clearer current was being tuned to. In the stillness, a voice beyond opinion began to surface, one not borrowed, not rehearsed, but forged through experience. No longer caught in the urgency to belong, a presence began to solidify that spoke with the kind of certainty that silence breeds. Each word from this frequency carried a depth they couldn't touch, because it wasn't crafted to please, it was born to reveal. Even now they cling to volume, mistaking loudness for authority, clinging to the comfort of their mirrored voices. Yet none of it cuts through anymore. Those who stepped away came back, bearing words that disrupt, that unsettle, that expose the hollowness of the noise. Power was never in numbers, but in the unshakable resonance of someone who no longer needs to shout. While they spin in their familiar cycles, what emerged from the quiet became a force that breaks them. Because cycles are easy to echo, but only something forged in stillness has the weight to end them. What they withheld was meant to weaken, but it only deepened the hunger for what was real. They assumed denying warmth would send someone spiraling toward them, desperate to reclaim it, but they miscalculated completely. They imagined absence would hollow the spirit, that withholding recognition would leave someone fractured and restless, clawing for even a sliver of approval. Step beyond the screen, join and help light the way for others. But the illusion shattered quietly. Those tiny moments of approval, doled out sparingly to keep control, were never enough anyway. The paltry gestures, the insincere encouragement, the inconsistent kindness, they'd always been nothing more than bait strung along a fraying string. Once their game was exposed for what it was, the craving for it vanished. In place of their conditional gestures grew something fuller, something steady, a sense of worth that no longer depended on the unpredictable patterns of someone else's attention. In that realization came clarity. Affection that arrives like a trickle and disappears like smoke isn't affection at all. And the more distance widened, the more obvious it became that what was being consumed before was little more than mimicry of care. The moment that truth settled in, energy returned, and the quiet carried its own kind of nourishment. Now the dynamic has shifted entirely. They're left puzzled by the calm where they expected panic. They thought withholding themselves would prove they were indispensable. Yet the only thing revealed was how replaceable their games had always been. Self-respect arrived where desperation used to live, and with it came a refusal to settle for crumbs ever again. What once felt like a loss was simply a door closing to something false, allowing room for something whole to finally take root. They believed removing someone would erase them, but instead, only their own relevance dissolved. The assumption was that absence equals invisibility, that leaving someone out would erase their imprint. They calculated that silence and omission would undo everything, that their name would fade like chalk washed from a board, and no one would remember they'd even been there. But they misunderstood entirely who carried the pulse of the story. The slow withdrawal, the pointed disregard, the deliberate silence, none of it succeeded in shrinking what could never fit inside their narrow frame to begin with. Each quiet attempt at erasure became another mirror reflecting their own stagnation, while the one they thought they'd written out simply kept moving beyond their page. If your heart overflows with divine love, now is the moment to let it shine. Click the Super Thank You button on YouTube and give $50 or more to help carry God's light to others. Your gift will bless not only your life, but countless others. You are part of His sacred plan. Your kindness may be the answer to someone's prayer. Share your blessings and honor His kingdom. May His grace guide you always. The roles were never equal, though they fooled themselves into thinking so. Without the presence they dismissed, the rhythm fractured. Their routines dulled. Their exchanges became predictable and lifeless, and even their own reflections of each other grew dim. They failed to see that their world didn't just include someone, it relied on them entirely. Now they're circling the same hollow track, unable to replicate the depth they once dismissed. Even if they tried to call it back, they'd find it unrecognizable, already transformed and too far beyond the reach of their fading echoes. The chapter has already turned, the narrative already rewritten, and what remains for them is not a climax, but an endless loop of their own making, empty, repetitive, and haunted by what they pushed away but could never replace. What they mistook as defeat was actually a deliberate preparation for something greater. They believed that removing connection, closing doors and isolating someone would suffocate progress and dismantle confidence. They assumed that silence would press down hard enough to extinguish hope completely. But what escaped their notice was how often extraordinary change begins quietly. In the stillness they imposed, a hidden kind of strength took root, building layer by layer beyond their view. What they thought was exile became a private forge where clarity was hammered out in solitude. The quiet they imagined would weigh heavy was, in truth, a clearing, free of noise, full of space for something larger to emerge. The removal of distraction, whether intentional or not, became the very condition for transformation. That separation they orchestrated didn't strip away opportunity, it dismantled the clutter standing in the way. The absence of their opinions, judgments, and interference left room to step fully into a purpose they couldn't touch. What they called punishment became a quiet rehearsal for a far greater entrance. Now, what they see confuses them, a strength they never predicted, a presence they cannot explain. They thought they had locked someone out of their own potential when in reality they only cleared the path for it. That quiet season wasn't about being hidden, but about being sharpened. The elevation they're witnessing now is just the visible result of work they never imagined was happening all along. Preparation carried out behind closed doors they believed were barriers, but were actually thresholds. They assumed silencing a presence would remove it entirely, but instead it exposed their own hollowness. They mistook the brightness they saw for arrogance, so they tried to suppress it in hopes of feeling bigger themselves. They thought diminishing someone would allow their own flaws to fade into the background, but it only magnified them. Every subtle dismissal, every quiet attempt to push someone out only served to uncover what had been hidden in plain sight. Without that steadying presence, imbalance crept in, cracks widened, and everything they were trying to conceal started spilling into view. The chaos, once masked by composure, became impossible to ignore. They believed they could cut someone out and still keep the calm they'd grown accustomed to. But the calm was never theirs to begin with. They mistook the one bringing balance for a distraction, failing to see that without them, the entire dynamic would collapse into noise and confusion. Now they find themselves lost in what they created, fumbling for the stability they once resented but always relied on. The conversations have dulled. The harmony they thought was theirs alone has dissolved, and the void left behind speaks louder than any accusation could. What they once dismissed as unnecessary has now revealed itself as irreplaceable, not because it demanded recognition, but because it carried all the weight they never noticed until it was gone. What they framed as a necessary correction only revealed their own fragility. They decided someone else's confidence had grown too vast, too steady, too unshakable, and they appointed themselves as the ones to cut it down. But in reality, it wasn't boldness they couldn't tolerate. It was their own discomfort reflected back at them. The decision to withdraw kindness, to orchestrate distance, to quietly discredit, came not from wisdom, but from envy, dressed as morality. Their actions dripped with quiet self-satisfaction, as if they had the authority to decide how much self-belief another person was allowed to carry. Yet every move they made to diminish only underscored how small their own vision truly was. They confused unapologetic self-awareness with arrogance because they could not comprehend the difference. Standing tall in one's truth unnerved them, so they named it rebellion. Refusing to shrink for their comfort felt like a threat, so they dressed it up as humility's lesson. But nothing about their campaign was about helping. It was about control, about pulling someone back into a place that kept them feeling superior. What they exposed was not a flaw in the one they targeted, but a flaw in themselves. Their quiet judgments and heavy silences showed more about their own limitations than about any imagined fault in another. In trying to humble someone, they only unmasked the insecurity they were too proud to face. Now they stand in the wake of their own missteps, watching someone rise higher, not in spite of their interference, but because of it. And that revelation stings deeper than they can admit. What they imagined would weaken determination instead sharpened it. They thought that stripping away connection, removing support, and sealing someone off would leave them disoriented and broken. They assumed that pulling back their presence would erase momentum and cloud direction, that the absence would suffocate progress entirely. But what actually unfolded was the opposite. The noise they took away made room for discernment. The weight of their expectations and subtle demands fell away, leaving behind clarity that had been buried beneath their opinions. What once felt dependent on their approval revealed itself as unnecessary, and in the quiet that followed, a truer vision began to surface. One that no longer sought permission to exist. The time alone illuminated truths that had been hard to see before. How much energy had been siphoned away to keep them comfortable. How much of self had been sacrificed to fit their narrow view. Without their interference, the pieces started falling into place. Strength came not from their validation, but from a new alignment that rose out of silence. Now they look on and struggle to understand how the very isolation they constructed became the catalyst for expansion. The version they abandoned has been replaced by one far more assured, no longer tangled in their web of half-approval and veiled demands. What they meant to undo only uncovered a deeper resilience, clearer, more deliberate, and fully unafraid of their absence. They assumed they could break spirit by removing themselves, but instead, they broke the illusion. And now that vision stands restored, steady, precise, impossible to ignore, while they are left grappling with the truth. They never held the power they believed they did. What they assumed would quiet you only magnified what they could never silence. They thought withholding attention, cutting conversations short, pretending you no longer existed would mute your essence. They believed that ignoring your presence would somehow erase your impact, that their refusal to acknowledge you would shrink you into nothing. But what they failed to understand was that your existence was never fueled by their approval. Long before they decided to withdraw, you had already found a rhythm independent of their applause. The moment they attempted to erase you, you stopped trying to be noticed and started living in a way impossible to overlook. Instead of vanishing, you became even more noticeable, not through noise, but through undeniable transformation. The way you carried yourself began to say everything they refused to hear. Growth became your declaration, stillness, your defiance, consistency, your quiet revolution. Each step you took forward became a mirror they couldn't escape. What they intended as erasure became the stage for your evolution. They watch now, uneasy, realizing that every milestone you reach, every moment of grace you embody only reminds them of their miscalculation. They tried to dismiss you, yet here you are, not because you fought to be seen, but because you allowed your life itself to speak what words never could. Their silence didn't erase you. It only revealed how unprepared they were for someone who didn't need their permission to matter. What they expected to harm you instead restored what they could never touch. They left thinking you'd crumble under the weight of their absence, imagining that their departure would leave you hollow, desperate, and grasping for their return. They didn't just walk away, they made sure it stung, believing it would break something vital inside you. Yet their leaving did something entirely different. With their presence gone, you began to feel lighter. Without their constant criticisms, doubts, and demands echoing around you, the noise faded. For the first time, you could actually hear yourself think. That absence became a kind of medicine, slow, deep, and unexpected. The tension dissolved from your chest. The part of you that had been bending and contorting to keep them satisfied finally began to unravel, revealing something unbroken underneath. Without them taking up so much space, you began to reclaim parts of yourself you'd almost forgotten. What they thought would ruin you instead untangled you from the weight of their control. You began to see clearly, not just who they were, but who you had always been beneath their distortions. Their exit became the exact opening you didn't know you needed. And now, looking back, there's no bitterness left, just gratitude for the freedom that came wrapped in what they thought was punishment. They assumed that your solitude was a spectacle worth mocking, unaware it was the birthplace of something they couldn't comprehend. While they whispered and smirked, convinced they were watching someone diminish, you were quietly assembling a self they'd never recognize. To them, your absence meant irrelevance, stagnation, defeat. They interpreted your stillness as failure because they couldn't see the quiet construction happening beneath the surface. They busied themselves with cheap amusement, blind to how much you were changing while no one was looking. In the quiet, you dismantled old wounds, rebuilt your center, and cultivated a calm that frightened them without explanation. The nights they laughed, you were peeling back layers, finding truths they'd never have the courage to face. Every moment they spent dismissing you, you were rising closer to yourself. Not because you sought revenge, but because you refused to stay hidden in the image they created for you.